First of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Eric Talley. I am I'm a professor here in business law, and I teach corporations, contracts, corporate finance, mergers and acquisitions, and a number of other classes inside the sort of the business law side of the ball. I don't know most of you because I've been here only 3 years. I joined the faculty from UC Berkeley in the fall of 2015. We're going to try to structure this session as sort of a moderated interview, but we want to leave ample time for questions if you have them at the end. So at least someone was harassing us about possible question asking, and I encourage all of you to think about doing that. It makes it, particularly at 9:15 in the morning, it makes it a much more lively event for you and for us. So this is a panel on cybersecurity risk, and in part, the distributed reading is a project that I'm working on involving cybersecurity risk and informed trading in markets, including derivatives markets. And we're going to get into that a little bit. But I don't want to spend all or even a majority of our time talking about it, in part because of the fact that we've got Michael Bahar here from the LL.M class of 2008. He is and I am really pleased to welcome him back to Columbia, as well as the rest of you. He's a partner at Eversheds Sutherland in Washington, D.C. He did his LL.M in 2008 in international and national security law, studying with Matt Waxman and other people here at Columbia. And he is considered far and wide to be one of the nation's preeminent experts in cybersecurity and privacy. He advises clients in a variety of issues involving data protection, international law, national security, and cybersecurity. He's also had a significant amount of government service in national security fields, including deputy legal advisor to the National Security Council at the White House and general counsel, and sometimes peacemaker, I'm guessing, in the U.S. House Intelligence Committee. He's played a bunch of key roles in this capacity related to the law of cybersecurity. Drafted the cybersecurity, was one of the key drafters of the Cybersecurity Act of 2015, and 4 of the iterations of the annual Intelligence Authorization Act. He most recently played a central role in leading the House Committee's investigation into allegations of the Russian manipulation of the 2016 election. So I have spent the last 45 minutes talking to Michael in my office, and I kind of wanted to hog him for myself, but we're going to bring him down here. So please welcome me. Join me in welcoming Mr. Behar this morning. And let me start with the following, Michael. So for people in the audience, particularly in view of the fact that it's 9:15, and they don't specialize in this topic, what exactly do we mean by cybersecurity? What, when you describe your area of practice to other people, what does it mean to you? And is it just hacking into other people's computers, or is it something broader than that?
First of all, thank you for having me. It's actually awesome to be here, even if it's 9:15 in the morning. I've got a 9-week-old, so 9:15 might as well be noon. This is perfect for me. This is my zone. So yeah, cybersecurity is really much more than what I think people used to think about: a person with a hoodie in his parents' basement hacking away Wargames style. It's much more sophisticated and much more pervasive and much more pernicious, and it's largely now migrating to the great powers, the Russia, the China, the Iran, the North Korea, and they are really getting into the cybersecurity, or the offensive cyber game, for a number of reasons. One, to steal intellectual property. That's been going on for a while, but really where it's now going to is not to steal anything at all. It's actually to make things go boom, to actually bring down companies, especially in the West, especially in the United States, to disrupt business, especially in the West, especially in the United States, and to take it even one step further, and something we may talk about a little bit later, to actually undermine the integrity of certain key systems that the West relies on, whether it's GPS signals, whether it's financial information, right? One of the things that when I talk to banks, big banks, like what are the things that keep me up at night besides my 9-week-old, or should keep up the banks? I say, manipulation of data, subtly changing that data. And they always ask me, why would anyone do that? How do they steal money that way? And I say, it's not about stealing money. It's about bringing you down, bringing the entire Western banking system down. And how they do that is if you go to the ATM one day and you didn't take any money out, but those values change, then you go back again and the values change again, suddenly you're going to be like, I'm done with this bank. I'm taking my money out and putting it somewhere else. You do that en masse, the banking system collapses. So, yeah, do a lot of fun stuff in cybersecurity, but that's what we're talking about. It's much more than just hacking to steal. It's hacking to destroy, hacking to disrupt.
Let me push you a little bit on this. I mean, have you noted? Obviously, the election of 2016 was a moment that is now still being unraveled. And to what extent did Russia and other potential foreign entities play a role in disrupting as opposed to stealing? Does state involvement in cybersecurity, does it follow a cyclical pattern? Does it go by the season of elections, or is there anything predictable about it?
It's a great question, and the people, I think, seem to lose sight of that. The Russian meddling into the 2016 election started with a hack, so with a phishing campaign, where a senior official in the Democratic National Convention clicked on a link he shouldn't have. But to your point, that may have been the triggering event that started the sort of exfiltration of that data, but actually, in the intelligence community, we were watching for a couple years going, and all this is public, I'm not saying anything I shouldn't be, why are the Russians starting to get into think tanks? Years ago, like what do they want out of think tanks? Are they stealing academic papers? Is that something that's really valuable? And what we realize is, no, they're not in there for the purposes of getting into the think tanks, although they're happy to know if an anti-Russia document is going to come out before it comes out. They're getting in there so that they can spoof those email accounts and then get to those who read the emails of the think tanks. And that's how they get in. And that's really interesting for companies as well, because a lot of companies say, why are the Russians going to be involved in me? Why are the Iranians and North Koreans? Why are any hacker going to think about me? And a lot of times, even if they're not thinking about you, they know that you do business with those that they really want, so they will hack you to get at them. And while they're in, hey, they might as well steal whatever else is valuable. Once you're in, you're in.
That's interesting. And how would you say, I mean, traditionally people have thought of cyber security issues of being like the guy in the hoodie in his basement. I should note, for those of you who are old enough to remember this, that this week marks the 35th anniversary of the release of the Matthew Broderick film Wargames, which is sort of the at least on film, what sort of brought hacking to common attention. There are no doubt private individuals who engage in these types of activities as well. What distinguishes them from sovereign nations or intelligence services?
And it's such a great point, because in one sense it's getting more sophisticated. And of course, when you talk about nation states, they not only have, for them it's all about the intent, the capability they have, and they have it en masse, right? Huge, armies of people whose sole job is to go in and hack. That's what they do from 9 to 5. And then for some countries, they're allowed to go hack on the side in the evenings. But for the individual, the person, the Matthew Brodericks of the world, you no longer have to be a genius to be a hacker, because while on the one hand it's getting much more sophisticated, on the other hand it's getting much more commoditized. You can go, any of you right now can go into the dark web and get like Hacking for Dummies. And if you have a question, they've got customer support. I kid you not. Right? You can download the tools. Be careful when you download those tools, but you can download the tools and say, I want to go after that company or that person. You can do it, and if you've got any questions, give them a call. They're happy to help. It really is that commoditized now on the other end.
That's really fascinating. And in fact, the general sort of norms of sharing various types of data tools, scraping tools, the acquisition of GitHub in the last couple of weeks, in which some of the, some tools that might be related to hacking are quite plausibly stored, has made this sort of an interesting and highly complex field. You were involved directly in drafting of various types of legislation and regulation around cyber hacking. How effective is that? How effective is a legislative or regulatory type of solution to stave off some of these threats?
We're all lawyers here, so I can answer this without the usual caveat of it being a lawyer answer. Depends.
It's not the first time that's been uttered in this room.
Exactly. So you've got to be really careful when you're dealing with technology. And cybersecurity is obviously going to have a huge technology element. Why? Because by the time the legislation or regulation gets through its gestation period, which takes a while, the technology will have already changed. And by the time it even goes from, both being passed by the House and Senate, even those 8 days or so that the president has to sign the bill, the technology will have already changed. So when you're designing legislation, it has to be tech neutral. Right? It can't be tied to, you must do this, you must have this specific antivirus, you must have this firewall, because all that's going to be outdated, and every hacker can get around everything if they try enough. So the key with legislation is to be principles-based. It's to set the standards that say you must have adequate or reasonable technical and organizational measures, and most importantly, the really good regulations, good in the sense of well-drafted, like the New York Department of Financial Services cybersecurity regulation relevant to banks and insurance companies, or the European GDPR that just came online last week or 2 weeks ago. The key for those is, what are you doing on the front end? What are your plans, programs, and procedures to not necessarily prevent a hack, but sure, go ahead, try to prevent a hack, but keep a bad day from turning tragic by responding to the hack in the right way. For example, I've got now a 3-year-old daughter in addition to a 9-week-old. And about a year ago, she was walking, but occasionally she would just trip and fall. And she would just she wouldn't get hurt, but she'd get so embarrassed that she would fall. And without even thinking about it, I said to her, it's okay, don't worry about it. You just have to learn how to fall and get back up. And I said, that's perfect for cybersecurity. Right? You will be hacked. If somebody wants to hack you, you will be hacked. And every company is getting hacked many times a day. It just depends how far they're getting in. So the question is not about falling. It's about learning how to fall and how to get back up really quickly and keep a bad day from turning tragic. And what makes it tragic, of course? Litigation, regulatory enforcement action, business interruption, and reputational damage that comes from a hack that was poorly planned for. That's why, to your questions, the best regulations are looking at the front end to say, what are your plans in advance? Are you planning for the worst and hoping for the best? Or is hope your plan? And hope is not a plan.
I hope not. So give me a little bit of a sense of what, as an organization, I know that there's a chance I can be hacked. There are certain things that I can do.
No, I hacked you on the way in.
I suspect you did. You found out just how uninteresting my life is. So you're going to be hacked, or there's a good chance you are, and you're trying to allocate from an organizational perspective your resources in a way that may, in some circumstances, be able to deter a hack, may, in some circumstances, expedite your ability to respond to a hack. What kind of liability exposure do you have if you are hacked, possibly releasing Social Security numbers, credit card numbers, health information of your clients, employees, students to outsiders? How's that changed, and what kind of exposure are you likely to have in 2018?
See, the interesting thing about the litigation aspects of liability is there have been so few cases. We're truly at the nascent stage, and most of the cases, and our firm is handling one of the big ones, is that we're still at the standing phase. We're still trying to figure out in the courts, if you have had your Social Security number stolen, does that alone give you sufficient standing to bring a case in federal court? Those are still working their way through. There's big circuit splits. The Supreme Court has made a decision in the so-called Spokio case, but even that is very difficult to figure out. So what I always say is look to the regulators. And this one is really interesting. The SEC, about a year ago, recently fined a broker-dealer investment advisor $1 million for a hack that caused no damage. And why? They said because you didn't have the proactive plans, policies, and procedures in place. So the regulatory bellwether is, what are you doing that's reasonable on the front end to respond to a breach when it does occur? Obviously, if you have no antivirus, if you have no firewalls, if you're letting people, plug in thumb drives right after their trip overseas, okay, and you get hacked, you're probably going to be found negligent for allowing that kind of stuff. But short of that, it's really going to be, did you have a good disaster recovery plan in place? When the hack came in, where's your GC call? Did your GC call your CEO? Did you mobilize forces? And one thing to think about in this room is there are always two people who lose their jobs in a high-profile hack. One is the CEO, and the other one is the general counsel. So this is huge. Most people think cybersecurity is about IT, information technology. It's not. There's a huge piece of IT, right? But again, it's about what do you do once the hack happens. And that's what the role of the lawyer is. And we've talked about bad days becoming tragic. The individual that stands between a bad day and a tragic day is the lawyer. It really, really is the case. The lawyers make that difference.
Really interesting that the connection with basically principles of corporate governance and collective decision making intersect so heavily in cybersecurity.
Absolutely. You also want to play to the business judgment rule.
Yeah.
Right. So one of the things we tell people is if you do not have cybersecurity on your board agenda, you're in a whole lot of hurt if something goes wrong. Merely putting it on there, recording your minutes, shows that you've paid attention to it. You're probably going to survive so many motions dismissed right there alone. But the interesting thing is, too, is there's a reason for that, is once it's on the board agenda, then the C-suite knows they have to prepare for the board meeting. If the C-suite knows they have to prepare for the board meeting, it's going to start trickling down, and people are going to start to care about cybersecurity. So it doesn't take much. And one of the things is it's easy to get overwhelmed because you're getting potentially hacked by the Russians, the Iranians, the North Koreans, in addition to, the Matthew Brodericks of the world. And people are like, what am I going to do? I'm just going to throw up my hands. And what I say is, you don't have to outrun the bear. You only have to outrun the slowest camper. Take a second to think about that. It's a bit macabre, but you don't have to outrun the bear, meaning you just have to be reasonable. If you're the fastest camper, you're overspending on cybersecurity, right? You're being inefficient. If you're not doing those basic things like having plans, policies, and procedures in place, you're the slowest camper. Not only are you going to get hacked, but then the regulator's going to come in if you're a regulated entity, the plaintiff's bar is going to come in, your customers are going to be like, why would I trust you with my data anymore? But you want to be right at that sweet spot.
By the way, I should tell you that I love this analogy. You can't be the slowest camper, but since I'm a little ahead of you in the child rearing department, I morphed that very quickly when I had young babies. You always want to be at worst the second noisiest baby on the airplane, and no one remembers they always remember the noisiest, but never remember the second.
Remember that
noisiest.
we have an overseas flight on Wednesday.
There you go.
Starting at midnight.
So I want to talk a little bit about some of these securities market aspects, but before doing that, can you give us a sense from an organizational perspective? A hack occurs, and it appears that it is not Matthew Broderick. It appears that it is North Korea or Israel or Russia or China. And at that point, it becomes not only a concern for your company, but it could be a national security concern. And I would anticipate that that's a juncture where it may be important, it may be actually required to bring in the state, federal government, and regulators into the picture. Give us a sense how that interaction works.
Yeah, and that's really tough. Because when you first get a hack, you have no idea who's hacking you, what's the extent of it. Sometimes you have 72 hours to report that hack. So if you're in New York State, as we all are right now, and you're a regulated entity in New York State, you've got 72 hours. If you're subject to European GDPR, which is remarkably extraterritorial, despite being a European data regulation, you also have 72 hours. If you're in Singapore, you have 12 hours to make a report. And interestingly, if you're in New York and Singapore, if you've reported anywhere, you also have to report in New York, even if you didn't have to report in New York originally. So suddenly, if you're also doing operations in Singapore, you have to realize your hands are really bound, and you're going to have to make a quick report, and no regulator wants to read about something in the papers. They're going to want to find out from you. So one thing is you definitely need to have a global regulatory strategy if you are a global entity.
Kind of makes you wonder whether it was Trump or Kim Jong-un who demanded negotiations in Singapore.
Yeah, exactly. So, and again, it's going to vary a little bit by what sector you're in. But yeah, you need to have that global regulatory strategy. You have to realize that, like everything in the military, there is a fog of war. You won't know right off the bat who hacked you and why. So you need to start to do that investigation. And then you get a critical point is, well, I could do this myself, or I can call in the FBI. And that's a big deal for companies to say, do I want the FBI rummaging around my servers? Who knows what else they're going to find? The FBI, I will say, has gotten a lot better about just focusing on that and treating companies as victims, not as potentially, wrongdoers in themselves. But that's why what we also say is, especially if you're a GC or if you have legal responsibility for IT or cybersecurity, it's good to have a good relationship, personal relationship, go to coffee with your local FBI agent who deals with cyber. And to have their mobile, their cell phone number, rather than go through some portal, which may be down if you're really attacked, is also huge. But yeah, the FBI will then tell you, hey, you may think it's this, but it's really that. And remember, when you're going up against a nation-state hacker, they're magicians. Right? The magician wants you to look there because what's really happening is over there. Or you ever watch kids play soccer or football? Meaning, right? They all chase the same ball, right? Or some just sort of stand around looking around. But all of them chase that same ball. That's what the more sophisticated hackers are going to be counting on. The FBI can help to say, yeah, I know you're all looking there, but really the magic is happening here. So you'll start with the DDoS attack. Your website is down. And you think that's the attack? No, it's a distraction because they're stealing all your data and they don't want you to see that.
That's fascinating. So let me give you a hypothetical, which is actually not so hypothetical.
Okay.
And I want to pivot a little bit into some of this stuff that I've been working on as well. So in 2015, 2016, there was a company called St. Jude Medical, which made pacemakers.
Yeah, good example.
And a pacemaker obviously, shocks your heart into beating at an appropriate rate. It's implanted inside the body cavity, and therefore it requires some device to make it to set the rate at which at which your heart's going to be beating. And there was an app for that St. Jude sold you along with the pacemaker. You had a little controller. A cybersecurity firm called MedSec figured out how to hack that app. So that someone could sit down on a park bench with an iPhone, press a few buttons, and give Granny or Gramps a heart attack simply by controlling that hacked application. Now, this happens frequently in the medical device field. It happens in other fields as well. Most recently with AMD this past spring. What MedSec did, though, is they didn't go to St. Jude Capital or St. Jude Medical. They went to a hedge fund. They went to Muddy Waters hedge fund and said, "Here's what we found out. Here's a 28-page report on how to hack these pacemakers." And Muddy Waters which is well known for doing this, they took a substantial short position in St. Jude Medical, announced their short position, and on the same day distributed this 28-page how-to manual on how to hack the app, to the great interest of many disillusioned teenagers who were really sick and tired of Granny or Gramps at that point. Is that illegal? Should it be?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things in that. It's a great question, and that's a prime example of, for those who are not data-rich companies or working data-rich companies, to realize, why does cybersecurity apply to me? It's because of the IoT, the Internet of Things, the ability, even in a pacemaker, to have a chip. And there's going to be a theme in all my analogies. We've already talked about, outrun the bear. So think about a Russian nesting doll. Right, those Russian dolls that have dolls, smaller and smaller dolls, and usually, in there. That's the IoT, and it's an obligation on every company now to start to unpack each one and think about what are those devices in there, not only from a cybersecurity perspective, because you want to know some of the biggest attacks have occurred via coffee makers and DVRs because they have chips, but also from a regulatory perspective, because the FTC recently fined a toy manufacturer for a teddy bear. Why? Because that teddy bear was speaking to children, but also one subcomponent was actually recording the child's voice and sending it off for marketing purpose to some third party. And the FTC was like, no, you, toy manufacturer, are responsible because it's on you to unpack the Russian nesting doll. So that's one thing, that the IoT is that everybody's impacted by cybersecurity and its regulatory environment. And if you're also a public company and you've got obligations to shareholders, the SEC is now taking a very strong stance, including about 3 or 4 weeks ago when they made another pronouncement on this, as well as fined Yahoo, is you've got to report this information very quickly. So if in your hypothetical, the company knew of this fault and knew of this exploit, the SEC would expect them themselves to come out and report it. If some company just has publicly available information and is not doing a hack in and of itself, then I think that would be fair game. But if you're actually hacking the device, you're potentially criminally liable under the CFAA, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, as well as that affords a private right of action as well. So it depends,
Yeah, I mean, certainly it doesn't seem, for those of you who remember learning insider trading in law school, this would not be the type of thing that would conjure up the usual pattern for insider trading. There's no fiduciary obligation. These are true outsiders. They're not misappropriating information from someone else. They're essentially generating it. And it's a tough policy question as well, because from a general securities markets perspective, it's kind of nice to think in general there are arbitrageurs doing research on companies that are underpriced and overpriced and trying to trade on that information. That's one of the things that causes generally securities markets to be informationally efficient, and that's a good thing. On the other hand, it does seem like there's maybe a little bit of harm being visited at the same time when you throw out the 28-page how-to manual.
Yeah, but again, if I put back on my policy hat that I just took off a year ago, you're right, that does create additional incentives to be more cyber secure, to actually not just roll out a product because you want to be first to market with it, but also first to security with it, right? It's the same idea as, you're going to build a bridge. You can build the most beautiful bridge in the world, but if it collapses, that's a problem. And I think we need to get to a place with software and technology development where we're treating that less as a craft and more as a discipline, akin to architecture or bridge building or car building. You never build any of this stuff without safety being part of it. But for us now, it's like it used to be in the 80s. Like in the 80s, you threw in a clock everywhere. Even baseballs had clocks. Like, it was just like weird. You threw in a clock. Now everyone's just throwing a chip in there for, a couple of cents. But those chips are easy to hack, and once you're in, you're in.
Tell me a little bit about the other side of this market. Again, it's more likely to be the for-profit hackers as opposed to the nation states. So another alternative that a hacker might have who discovers a cybersecurity flaw is to go to the company itself and to make some sort of a bounty demand or a reward demand to say, listen, if you hire us as a consultant, we'll show you the weakness. We will maybe even help you fix it for another modest fee. How robust is that market? How well does it work? Is it something that is you should just treat as a cost of doing business, or is it kind of an organized shakedown?
Or both.
All of the,
Yeah.
all of the above. I mean, there's a very high-profile case going on about that, where, somebody did identify a flaw, and they were paid, and the company didn't report that as an actual breach, and now they're getting into a lot of trouble for that. So when you get those situations, they tend to be very fact-specific. If somebody just finds it, they're a white-hat hacker, they're just telling you about it, you fix it, but no data's been breached, okay, right? You've solved that problem. But if they actually are taking something out and proving their bona fides that way, yeah, you might have an issue there that is a reportable incident.
Yeah, and this seems to be one of the great asymmetries between these two approaches that a
Yeah.
hacker might take. You're essentially putting the company on notice much more quickly,
Right.
And there are all kinds of legal obligations ensue.
But here's another way you can
Yeah.
do it. I was just thinking about it. Because of the IoT, you can find out, because you're a researcher, about a infirmity in a certain chip. But you know that chip is used by a company. You can contact that company and say, I know of an infirmity in your systems because I know of it in this component that you use. And that may create a different scenario, right?
This is actually quite similar to what happened to AMD in March. There was an Israeli cybersecurity
Yeah.
firm that found several components, many of which since then seem to have been revealed not to be huge issues and solvable issues. But they spent a year trying to uncover this portfolio of issues with AMD chips, asked for a bounty apparently unsuccessfully, and then contacted a hedge fund themselves,
Yeah.
giving AMD 24 hours as opposed to the usual couple weeks to respond to the
And
to
a
the
lot
hack.
of it, I was in the Navy. I still am. I'm still in the reserves. I was in the Navy for 10 years on active duty, and been maybe 6 or 7 years now in the reserves. And one of the things that I really like, and I try to apply in this situation, is when naval aviators, fighter pilots get in problems, when they get lost in the air. And what they say is climb, confess, conserve. Climb, get really high, take the high ground, right? Confess, say, hey, I'm lost, I've done something wrong, and conserve your fuel, conserve your capital. This is going to be a while. And I think in those type of situations, that's something good to fall back on, because at the end of the day, if you're open, chances are you're going to have a little bit of short-term pain, but you're going to save yourself the long-term pain. And that's really hard, because the short-term pain is definite. The long-term pain is I have to discount by the probability of it, and no one who's cutting checks wants to take that.
Yeah.
But that's what I always think of. Climb, confess, conserve.
Let me. So, how do you instill, from an organizational perspective? It's one thing to say, okay, the board is going to try to take on these issues when they come about, but also trying to percolate down into the organization, a sense of awareness and adherence to some of these principles. Let me give you an example, which is a very hot example right now. When the Equifax breach occurred, this got escalated, pretty quickly to the board. At some point, they realized we've got to go into damage control. They called one of their programmers to say, didn't tell them anything. Said, we just think it would be a great idea if we had some sort of a website set up just in case we were ever breached, so that people could go to the website and check their information. And we were hoping you might be interested in designing one of those by 7 a.m. tomorrow morning. He says no, gets a call back from the CFO saying, we really want you to do this by 7 a.m. tomorrow morning. Said no again. And then they found someone else. And this guy called his broker and dumped all of his unrestricted shares in Equifax, and is now has been indicted for insider trading. Now, this was not a board-level employee. This was sort of mid-level, skilled employee. But it's one of these issues that once you're in damage control on a cyber threat, you pretty much have to rally the troops. This is not something you can just be doing from the board level, right?
Right, but without commenting on any particular case, you've got to start rallying the troops well before time zero. Right, left of boom, as we say, before something goes wrong. They have to understand. One thing are the controls in place. For example, during a breach scenario, you freeze all inside, stock deals. Right, nobody's allowed to trade stock at that point. Just make it easy. But the other is creating this culture of cybersecurity so that people know what to do. Right, from don't click on suspicious links. It's amazing how many people do it. Even when you get trained, how many people do it. And when the Department of Defense gets hacked, they often find out when they get hacked, it traces back to a Monday morning at like 8 a.m. Because somebody is just really tired, haven't had their coffee yet, clicking through their inbox to clear it out over the weekend,
Right.
and boom, they've clicked on the link, right? But everywhere you go in the Pentagon or anywhere else, there are signs all over. Don't click on phishing. Don't plug in any USBs. You've got to sort of create that sort of awareness at all levels. And then also what to do if you do click on a link, how do you handle it? Or as you go up the chain, what do you do? It's a culture now. It's like public health, right? You've got to treat cybersecurity like public health. When you think about it that way, a lot of stuff just starts to make sense.
I've read in recent days that, in fact, one of the biggest potential targets for a cybersecurity risk is the iPhone and mobile phones and personal digital assistants. What sort of movement have you seen in this area from a regulatory or a liability perspective?
Again, from both perspectives, they tend to be tech neutral. They're agnostic on the platform or how. What makes devices like the iPhone or the Android phone so attractive, it's a one-stop shop if you're a hacker. So really what you want to do is think about it, again, like ships or airplanes, right? The reasons why ships don't sink nearly as often as they used to is because you can compartmentalize, right? You close a compartment so all the flooding is contained, right? Airplanes have backups to backups to backup systems, right? So even if a couple of them fail, you're still going to be able to land this thing. And that's also important anytime you have a multiple sort of supported device, is to say, okay, even if they were to get into my iPhone, can they get into my Chase Bank app? And even if they can get into that, what controls are in place to make sure, that's why you can only transfer out $5,000 at any one time, right? It's because they're checking to make sure nobody's trying to clean you out and give you some time to know about it. So you want to have what we call a layered defense strategy. So for example, the first time when I deployed to Afghanistan, once I flew into Kabul. When you fly into Kabul from the air, which is a very scary experience, I can tell you that, because the mountains are so high and your helicopter is not that high and you're like eye level with people. But when you're flying over it, you see all these rings in Kabul. And I was like, what are these rings, these circles? And one, of course, the innermost ring is the green zone that you've all heard about. And the green zone is this most heavily fortified, heavily protected. And as you radiate out, there's less and less and less security. A lot of times people ask, well, why don't we put the entire Kabul, the entire Afghanistan within the green zone, and then we'll solve this, and it'll be super secure. The problem is, of course, then nothing can get done, because it's so secure, it's very restrictive. And the sort of lesson for that is the same idea from a cybersecurity perspective. Figure out what are your vulnerabilities, your crown jewels, and protect those the most, then sort of radiate outwards and have that layered defense strategy. Because we want these phones to be convenient. We want to be able to bank from home or wherever we are. But as it gets closer and closer to what we really care about, our life savings, we want to have additional protections on that.
Interesting. Let me, before we open it up to questions, I want to pivot to one last topic, which isn't a natural on first blush with cybersecurity, but has some interesting correlations to it, and that's blockchain and cyber, and cryptocurrencies. Now, I think all of us in this room hear, either apocalyptic or celebratory pronouncements about blockchain and cryptocurrency. First of all, what is blockchain technology and what are cryptos, and how might they relate to sort of questions related to cybersecurity issues?
So blockchain, so cryptocurrency like Bitcoin that people have heard of is based on this underlying technology called distributed ledger technology, or blockchain. And that's just really, it is what it sort of says, is basically the easiest way to describe it. It's distributed ledger, right? If you go back to the Medicis, you had, one set of books, and no matter where it was, it can line up. Distributed ledger, now everyone sort of has the key, and everybody in the aggregate, via computerized algorithms and math, check the authenticity of it.
Yeah, good analogy. Those of you who've used Google Docs and realized that you can be editing the same document with 5 different people at the same time. There's sort of a local version of that document stored on all of your machines, and the idea is that look, if we all agree with one another, then that sort of authenticates what's in this document.
So from a cryptocurrency, that's a way to, people love this idea because it keeps it out of central government hands and you can be anonymous, right? But the underlying technology of blockchain is fascinating because it has many different uses. One of which, we were talking about is the logistics space, where everybody is feeding information along the supply chain or the distribution network, and that's how we're going to improve efficiencies, accuracies, get things to consumers, much faster. That's all really good. And then there's a real cybersecurity value to DLT or distributed ledger technology as well, because we talked about this earlier. One of the biggest concerns I have in the next wave of cybersecurity threats is data manipulation, subtly changing that data. But if you go to a distributed ledger technology, it's much more difficult to pull that off because everybody has to agree. And so if somebody's manipulating it, the system will know that's fraudulent, and that might be a good way to do it. But on the other hand, from the cryptocurrency, people love it because it is free of governments and it's anonymous. But most governments are not happy about this, and most individual investors are going to not be happy about this. There is this gold rush mentality now, but there's a lot more fraud going on, and I think governments are increasingly realizing that, like any type of security or even commodity, depending on what you consider it, we have to protect the individuals.
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing. I will tell you that from someone who teaches contracts, the idea of an alternative verification device as opposed to a third-party court who essentially passes judgment using these antiquated doctrines like the parole evidence rule and the statute of frauds, which are essentially about the reliability of the evidence that's in front of a judge. That's actually subject to some degree of disruption by distributed ledger technology on the blockchain level, right? If you have an alternative way to verify information about what is and is not in a contract, in a distribution agreement, or an M&A agreement, even, it takes, it actually opens up certain types of agreements that wouldn't otherwise be available. On cryptocurrency, it's clear that governments are concerned about this. First of all, cryptos are a great attraction to people who are really interested in money laundering and tax fraud. Yeah. Governments themselves get an awful lot of value out of having people out there in the world deciding to hold their printed bills. It's essentially an interest-free loan to the government. So the fact that there are briefcases in South America filled with $100 bills also constitutes what's known as a benefit of seniorage to the U.S. government, also the European Monetary Authority. What can you do with a cryptocurrency that you couldn't just do with PayPal or Visa or some other sort of standard payment system that's been around for a long time?
Really? I mean, and that's what we're trying to figure out too. So what are the advantages if you take away anonymity? Right, and what are the advantages to not having a central bank being involved? And those are the questions that people have a hard time answering who are not just ideologically happy about, I don't want government involved, or who don't want to get up to something they just want to be anonymous about. And the other thing too is, and you bring up a great point about verification of contracts. And maybe before we go to questions, I'll do my last sort of zoological analogy, but also about bears, and talk about polar bears for a second. When we talk about blockchain, I always think about polar bears. Why? I know it's random. Because polar bears can't outswim a seal, right? So they don't even try. But they know one thing about the seal, and that's all they need to know, that the seal has to breathe. So they wait in the holes in the ice so that when the seal comes up, that's when they get them. That's all they need to know. And it's going to be the same thing with distributed ledger technology. Everyone who's the technologist will say, this is unbreakable. This is foolproof. And let me be absolutely clear. There is no such thing as unbreakable, no such thing as foolproof. Because at the end of the day, there is a breathing hole. There is a vulnerability that somebody will figure out, and that's where they will wait. So if you go back, for example, to, was it now maybe 3 years ago, about the big encryption debate that happened over the shooting in Orlando. Very horrible, right? And the idea being that these are unbreakable encryptions. Not really, because all it means is once you get onto your iPhone, you can read the unencrypted messages. That's the breathing hole. Now, of course, that makes it harder if you're trying to do surveillance en masse, but if you know that I'm looking after your phone, I get on your handset, I can read the encrypted messages unencrypted. Same way, Google Docs. If I pretend to be you on your machine, Google Docs, that's how I can get around that system. So everyone's agreeing, but I'm the interloper. So there's always a way in, and that's what I always caution. So think outrunning bears and polar
I've been
bears.
keeping an inventory here.
Exactly,
We've
yeah.
got
Sleep
don't be the
deprivation.
slowest person in the race, left of boom, layered defense strategy, climb, confess, conserve, and polar bears can't outswim
Too many analogies.
a seal.
All right.
I think I'm going to use all of them without attribution in my classes. And speaking of which, one last thing before I open it up to questions, and given that this is a reunion,
Yeah.
Let's bring this back to the time you spent at Columbia. What attracted you to come here? What sort of things did you take from your education here out into this really kind of a fascinating area of practice that you've pursued? And for young alumni or students who are interested in pursuing that kind of path as well, what sort of things should they be doing to cultivate that sort of trajectory?
Yeah, I mean, the great thing about, my time at Columbia was that I had graduated from law school in 2002. So I had now been out there working for 6 years, and I was with the Navy. And I think the Navy suddenly realized, this guy's doing a lot of law. Let's make sure he actually knows what he's talking about. So let me send him back to law school. So they sent me back, and I got the real privilege of working with Matt Waxman, professor here, who had just started that year before. And I had just a year to really think sort of the bigger thoughts, to write 3 or 4 papers. It was an incredible experience. I see one of my classmates at least. So that alone was not the best experience getting to know Carl. No, I'm joking. But no, it was great because I got to also meet people who were outside of my little bubble, right? Whether it's the military, the national security field, or even the United States, I got to meet a lot of people who have foreign perspectives as well. So that was an enormous influence, an enormous help. Being able to sit and write and think deeply about something, because usually, especially in the national security, but in every legal field, you're responding to the fire of the day. You're not really taking the time to lift your head up and look over the horizon. Columbia sort of allowed me to do that. And I think the third thing is, what I loved about Columbia, and especially with Matt Waxman, is the ability to perpetuate it. And by that I mean, I got lucky because the Navy sent me for the first time to Columbia. They're willing to spend the money and pay me to come here. So working with Matt Waxman, we created this system where 1 or 2 other Navy JAGs, Navy lawyers, can come every year to Columbia to get their LL.M. at the same price it would be to keep them in DC and go to GW or Georgetown. And then we expanded that to other law schools. Because one of the things we also realized too is it's really important for military folks to know civilians and civilians to know military. So, and that system, that program is alive and well, and it's been growing.
Oh yeah, the veteran and military students that come to Columbia are some of my favorites, except for one day a year when they invite me to join them on their Veterans Day fun run.
Yeah.
And I think they are having fun, but I'm being left in the dust.
Yeah.
So it does make me feel a little more confident about our military. Let me open it up to questions, sir.
Which one? Okay, that one.
From the bear. What about the Texan camper who turns around and just shoots the bear?
Ah, great
And
question.
so-
Hack back.
So you've been very focused on defense, and there's some very interesting questions. Could a company engage in offense, but would that offense somehow be illegal?
Yes, very illegal. That's good. This is one of the rare answers that are easy but remarkably hard during a crisis to deliver. And every company, especially the banks, right? There was a big New York Times article about 2 weeks ago about like these massive strategic operations centers, the SOCs that are military nature. They got all the cool TV screens going on. They've hired everybody out of NSA, CIA, and Cyber Command. And they're seeing these attacks, and they're getting pressure to say, can you stop it? Of course I can stop it. I just came from NSA. I can hack back and get them. Illegal. Computer, CFAA,
Yeah.
right? That is a Title 18. That's a criminal violation. There are a lot of CEOs on the Hill, I think they left, they did this about maybe a month ago, lobbying for it. And when we did the CyberSecurity Act of 2015, I was heavily lobbied to authorize this hackback. And the problem is that you may think you're getting hacked by Eric, but it turns out that Eric's computer was hijacked by the Russians. So all you're doing is just victimizing this guy, and you're not getting after that guy. If you see that and you're going to try to take on the Russians, no matter how big a company you are, you're probably poking the bear even more and will result in even worse.
Are there versions of this where you, instead of actively doing the Pac-Man reverse hack, you put a ticking time bomb in your own assets in something that
Yeah.
looks like a real honeypot? It gets extracted and then it explodes in the hands of the person that extracted it?
Yeah, I mean, that you can probably get away with more the honeypot, lure them into a certain area, attract them in, and then see that they're doing it, so that's how you know that you're hacked. And these are advancing more to say you lure them in, and once they're in, you can start to see what they're doing and learn from them and take it from there. But if you're actually going to cause effects on another's computer, you're incurring some legal, including criminal, risk and liability. Until that law is changed, I would advise against that. Now, again, if you're encrypting the stuff so that if they do exfiltrate it, it's gibberish, okay. If you phrase it as a ticking time bomb, probably not the best way
Somewhat
to do it.
colorful, yeah.
Again, how you phrase things really matter, because at the end of the day, you have to be reasonable, right? We talked about not running the bear. Being reasonable. So a lot of times how you phrase it is going to matter. So you avoid words like ticking time bomb because that doesn't sound very good. Or collateral, effect space. You want to do that and say, no, if they catch this stuff, it'll be rendered useless. But we're not going to otherwise impact their machine. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, but
Not set.
just to pursue it,
Yeah.
should that law be changed? How should it be changed?
That's my problem with it is I know people want it to be changed, but the nature of cyber is attribution is remarkably difficult. So you're shooting back at somebody who may have no idea they're involved, and now you've just hacked them. And if they do it, you create this sort of anarchic scenario, whereas for the most part, the monopoly on the use of force is done by the police, FBI, or potentially the military. So I, personally, I'm always open to hear good arguments, but from all the arguments that I heard in 2015 when we were passing it, I didn't see a compelling reason to authorize that, which wouldn't end up being used against us by a clever hacker. It would,
Interesting. Sir?
I guess I'm a lot more concerned about international actors than the ubiquity of, or the commoditization of hackers. I guess question number one is, are we behind the Russians with respect to this kind of cybersecurity or undermining our systems? And number two, aren't we using the wrong word? Because disruption, the professor used the word disruption. You then followed up with perniciousness and undermining trust and these kind of things and trying to bring up the, everybody, you want people to be more aware of these things. The word disruption has a positive connotation in Silicon Valley.
Oh.
And
That's a
to
good
me,
point.
disruption you need a better word than disruption.
No, I think that's a great point, because what I mean by disruption is disrupting, like actually what happened with WannaCry last summer, where the Maersk shipping lines lost $300 million because they couldn't deliver things on time. Nothing went boom. They didn't destroy. Destruction. But one more bear, Energetic Bear, a group probably out of Russia, is now all up in the U.S.'s critical infrastructure, right? Which oil and gas refineries, electrical distribution plants. Why are they there? To disrupt or to destroy, So that's what I meant by that. But those are very good points, because when you're talking tech, sometimes the words really matter.
Yeah, the commandeering of the term disruption over the last decade
Yeah.
has essentially changed its meaning
That's a good-
from
that's
its.
a great-
Yeah, so it may be incumbent on us to think of another word, because disruption has now gotten a positive connotation, except in my classroom.
But wait, what about this Russians being higher on the curve than us?
Oh, no. I mean, what I can safely say is, our capabilities remain first in class. But it's not about capabilities as much as it is about intent, right? Certain countries have the intent to do it. They have remarkably good capabilities. Sometimes those capabilities are borrowed from us. But I have no concerns at all about our abilities in this space. And then these become policy decisions about how much you want to do it in kind. And basically what you're talking about is cyber deterrence. And one thing that I will just remark on that is what I always said in the military, like doesn't have to be met with like. If somebody comes out and, throws a knife at you, you don't have to find an equally sized knife and throw it at the same velocity back at somebody. You shoot them with what you have. So you don't have to go after somebody in cyber just because they went after you in cyber. That's right, in Texas.
All right, we have time for, yes, sir.
I'm sure I speak for everybody in the room when I thank you for letting us hear this excellent
Good.
dialogue. Thank both of you. And my question for both of you is, what do you think are the implications of what you've been discussing for the law school curriculum?
Yeah,
In other words, not just talking about the law of cybersecurity, but should taking a course on computer programming for lawyers be encouraged or required?
Well, I'll take it first, guys, because we were talking about this yesterday. And one of the things, to go back to your question, the last one to me, was the beauty, again, of Columbia is the lifelong learning aspect represented by people who are here. Because cyber wasn't a thing even back when I was here, right, in 2008, which wasn't that long ago. And certainly not when it was just starting in 2002 during my JD. So one is the ability to say, okay, how do I quickly learn new things? At the same time, how do I analogize sufficiently and accurately to things that I've already learned? So I would say that's one. That the curriculum itself doesn't need to change as long as the emphasis is still on mental agility and the ability to learn new things quickly and to take what you have learned and apply it to new scenarios. But two, yes, and I think thanks to folks like Eric and Matt Waxman, they've upped the game here, especially when it comes to national security, which is a big deal, international law, which is increasingly a big deal, cyber, cryptocurrency. Those type of classes are worthwhile taking. But the best advice I ever got from law school during my JD was this, and most people disagree with it, but I will always say, and I said it's 100% right, never take a, what's it called? Not practical, clinical. Never do a clinical. And I'm like, why? So your whole life is a clinical. You get 3 years to sit in a classroom. So take those classes, because you don't get that opportunity again. I got lucky and I got 1 more year to take an LL.M. But still, never do a clinical, because when else do you have those time to think the great thoughts? I think Columbia is really good about that as well.
So for the record, I'm not going to take a position on that last point.
Yeah.
But
just saying the advice
one
I
thing
was given, yeah.
I will tell you is that not only do many people in the law school think that this is an appropriate direction to move our curriculum, it's already moving. This past January, I had the great pleasure to co-teach a 1-week intensive class. The legal methods class is being split into 2 chunks, one just before the fall term and then a January term course. And this class was a 1-week intensive course in predictive coding and machine learning. Involved a little bit of programming, but mainly it involved trying to get lawyers in a position where they sort of understand the type of interface they're going to have with IT professionals. Not only those of you who do litigation realize that machine learning took a big chunk of your portfolio
portfolio over a decade ago with e-discovery. But it's happening in transactional work and regulatory work. This is, sort of revolutionizing the field. And I think we're falling down on the job if we don't move heavily into that curricular area. Columbia, I think, and I'm somewhat of an interested party in this, but so are you, so it's okay, has been incredibly aggressive in doing so. Not only am I staffing classes in this field, Matt Waxman has been. We just hired a young person who was actually a computer programmer in his former life, Josh Mitz, who I co-taught this class with. We are bringing on board in August a senior person who is coming over from Berkeley named Justin McCrary. He ran their data sciences program for the entire campus at Berkeley. So it's a growing field, and it's a field that I think we not only feel an obligation to try to occupy, but we've been active in doing it over the last couple of years, and probably will continue to be, certainly if Matt and I and these other folks have anything to say about it. I think we are out of time, but I am sure, first of all, join me again in thanking Michael Bahar for being here.